this video we're going to look at how you calculate a percentage of an amount. In order to do that, I'm first going to teach you how to work out what I call the basic percentages. These 5 percentages here are the building blocks for all other percentages. If you can work these out, you can work out any percentage. So, first of all, 50%. In order to find 50%, you simply divide the number by 2, because 50% is the same as a half. For 25%, you divide by 4, because 25% is the same as a quarter. For 10%, you divide your number by 10. Now 5% is slightly different. 5% is just half of 10%. So what you're going to do is divide by 10 first to get yourself 10%, and then half of that, so divide that by 2. So 5% has 2 steps, divide by 10, and then divide by 2. And finally 1%. This means find 1/100th of your number, so you divide it by 100. Take a moment to jot these down because you'll need these for the questions in a moment. Okay, let's look at some examples then. We said 50% was the same as dividing by 2. So we simply do 700 divided by 2 to get 50% of 700. So half of 700 is 350. For 25%, we said that's a quarter, we divide by 4. So 48 divided by 4. And that gives us 12. A nice easy way to divide by 4 is to half it and then half it again. So half of 48 is 24, and then half of 24 gives you 12. 10%, we divide by 10, so we have 160 divided by 10, and that gives 16. Now, 5%. This was the one that was slightly trickier with 2 steps. So we're going to find 10% first. So we do 220 divided by 10, which equals 22. And then we're going to do half of that, because half of 10% is 5%. So we would do 22 divided by 2, which gives you 11. So 5% of 220 is 11, because 10% is 22, then you half that to get 11. And finally 1% is to divide by 100. So if we divide 350 by 100, we get 3.5. Okay, here are 5 for you to have a go at. Press pause, have a go yourself, and then press play, and I'll take you through the answers. Okay, here are the answers. For the first one, we do 300 divided by 2, which gives us 150. Then we have 44 divide 4, because that's what 25% is, 1/4, which is 11. Then 540 divide by 10 for 10%, which is 54. And then 600 divide by 10 first to get us 10%, which is 60. And then we do half of that, 60 divided by 2, which gives us 30. And the final question, 3,200 divided by 100, which equals 32. Those are the basic percentages. Let's look at a slightly harder question then. I've put the basic percentages on the right just so we've got them there as a reference, because we may need to remember them in a moment. So finding 30%, what I do is I look at my basic percentages and I think, how could I build up 30% using these? And there's a few options. I could do 25% and 5%, because 25 and 5, that makes 30. I could do 10%, 10%, and then another 10%, so 10% 3 times. In fact, there's loads of different options you could choose. You could do 1% 30 different times if you wanted. I think the easiest one to do is 10% 3 times. So what I'm going to do is write 10% equals 10% equals, and 10% equals. Now if I add up 10%, 10%, and 10%, I get 30%, which is what I'm being asked to do in this question, find 30% of 120. So 10% of 120 means divide it by 10, so you get 12. 10% equals 12, of course the same, and 10% equals 12. Now if we draw a line under these and add it up, 30% is 10%, add 10%, add another 10%, that must be 12, add 12, add 12. So 30% of 120 must equal 36. Let's try a different one. So 65% of 200. So again, I'm going to look over here at the basic ones that I've learnt, and I think 50% and 10% and 5% is what I'm going to use, because that will make 65. So 50%, 10%, and 5%, because that'll get me 65. So 50% of 200 means divide it by 2, that's 100. 10% is divided by 10, that's 20. And to get 5%, I half whatever I got for 10%. So half of 20 is 10. And if I add these up, 50 add 10 add 5, that's 65%. And then 100 add 20 add 10 is 130. That's how you approach these more difficult questions. You build up with the percentages that you already know. Here are 4 for you to have a go at. Press pause and have a go at them. When you're ready for the answers, press play and I'll tell you what they were. Okay, here are the answers then. So for the first one, I would have used 10% 4 times to get 40%. It's not the only way to do it, but you should get the same answer either way. So 10%, 10%, 10% and 10%. 10% of 600 is 60, so we have 60, 60, 60 and 60, and if you add all of those up, 40% would equal 240. For this next one here, I would use 10% and 5%, that makes 15%, and 10% of 240 is 24, half of that gets you 5%, which is 12, and if you add those up, you should get 36. And for this question here, 35%, I'm going to use 10%, 10% again, 10% again, so that's 30%, and then a 5%. So 10% of 150 is 15, 15, 15. Now half of that is going to give me a decimal. If you're struggling with halving a number like 15, think about halving the number below it first. So half of 14 is 7, so this one's going to be 7.5. And then if you add all of those up, you get 35%, which is going to come out as 52.5. And finally, the last question, I think for this one I'll go for 50%, 25%, that's 75 so far, and a 10%. So 50% of 480 is 240, 25% is 120, and 10% is 48. And if we add up all of these, we'll get 408. And that concludes the video on percentages of amounts.